Welcome.
Thank you so much, Zach.
Yeah, I'm excited. You just, we just got some tea. You shared with me your model of consciousness.
Right. No small feat.
No small feat. I was impressed. You said like 15 years of work into that.
Synthesizing everything I've read in many different areas. Yeah, it's pretty exciting to have gotten to that point.
Very impressive. And I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's perfect about this, the timing of it.
Yeah.
And the fact that it aligns so well with what was going on with Aldous Huxley and his experience and doors of perception. So.
Yeah. Well, I thought of you immediately because I was thinking about this piece for some reason and was thinking about doing it and was thinking like, all right, who would be good? And you had told me you were doing some, like working in a lab studying consciousness out in California for the last couple of years. And I know we had talked about psychedelics and stuff in the past, so I was like, oh, Nikki would be perfect.
Done.
And
yes.
Done. We're like, put it on the calendar.
Absolutely.
And we made it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Had you read this before, or was this your first experience with it?
I think I'd read excerpts from it, but not all the way through. So, yeah, it was a good experience for me as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, maybe I feel like it's probably one of the most famous psychedelic trips of all time.
For sure. Yes. All the hippies in the 60s read it. Yeah.
Yeah. It was very influential to like Timothy Leary and all kind of Ram Dass, all those guys.
For sure.
So maybe we could talk maybe about like the context of the piece, I guess. So Aldous Huxley was he was 59 when he first took mescaline. Which I was surprised to learn that because I had always thought that he was much younger. Like when I read it the first time, I had imagined him as like a young man, but he was 59, tripping for the first time. And I'm kind of glad that he was, in his older age and seasoned, because I don't know that he would have gotten the same kind of insights if he was like a 22-year-old or something,
He did have kind of a mystic mindset. He was really into Vedanta, which is a branch of Hinduism and Eastern religions. So he kind of had that basis already. So maybe, and a lot of his ideas aligned really well with it. But
right, like he was already kind of on the path.
Exactly.
And I thought it was funny learning this. He actually reached out to this guy what was his name?
Humphrey Osmond?
Humphrey Osmond.
Yes.
Yeah, who's a British psychiatrist who was studying mescaline at the time. And Huxley wrote him a letter and was just like, I want to be a guinea pig to study this.
Yeah, I love that phrase. The most willing guinea pig.
The most willing guinea. He's like, pick me, because this was pre psychedelic 60s. This was like, you couldn't just, go to a concert and get some mescaline or get some LSD. Like it was much harder to come by. It was only really being studied in laboratories.
Right.
So that was interesting to learn as well.
Yeah. But I mean, used for thousands of years by the Native Americans and then finally synthesized, I guess, in 1919 by a chemist. So,
yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, which is important so mescaline, which is not, maybe a lot of listeners aren't familiar with. It's definitely not as kind of famous as like psychedelic mushrooms or LSD, but it's the psychoactive chemical in peyote, the peyote cactus and the San Pedro cactus,
right?
Which, like you mentioned, has been used by Native Americans and indigenous Mexican people for thousands of years.
Correct.
In religious ceremonies.
Yes.
So this is by no means like a new drug. It just kind of knew that it was, like you said, synthesized in 1919.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, cool. The first kind of big theme that I saw him talking about was kind of this inherent problem that language presents, and that there's kind of a problem anytime we're trying to communicate our experience to another person. The way he puts it, he says, quote, "We live together, we act on and react to one another, but always and in all circumstances we are by ourselves." And he says, "By its very nature, every embodied spirit is doomed to suffer and enjoy in solitude." I took that to mean kind of like even when we are having a experience with another person, we are still having a unique subjective experience. And if we are then to try to communicate that to them, we're forced to use language, which is, pretty darn good tool that mankind has figured out, but it's still not as, accurate as having that spirit experience directly.
It is kind of mind-blowing to think about how it developed and how we are able to express abstract concepts. And because it all comes down to agreements that this word means this thing.
Yeah.
And so that we've gotten to the point where we can have a very intelligent conversation about very abstract ideas is quite an achievement for humanity.
Yeah.
If you think about it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And he says at another point, kind of like academics and the literate people of the world have this like fixation with just symbolic forms of learning, like i.e. reading and writing, versus the kind of more direct experiencing things firsthand.
Yeah, I feel like Goodwill Hunting kind of embodied that theme. Yeah. Where get out of bookland and actually experience life. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Or there's the we actually did a Robert Louis Stevenson podcast, and he said something like books are great in their own right, but they're a mighty bloodless substitute for real life.
Yeah.
And I think, from what I understand, Huxley would probably echo that as well. And
personally, I love the combo.
Sure. Yeah.
I've
absolutely
traveled the world reading, which is fantastic. So, 40 countries.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
You are like probably 30 more than I have. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I find the most interesting people are those that pursue both as well.
Yes.
That have a wealth of personal experience and are also well read, and that's what I enjoy as well.
Yeah, that's why we connect.
Yeah. Well, and he kind of criticizes a lot of philosophers and academics as just doing the kind of learning, book learning type of thing, and he says basically I'm the only one out here who's actually taken the psychedelic and knows what this thing is all about.
Yes.
And off of that theme as well, he kind of thinks that we can only really understand each other if we have had a similar experience. Like if I'm telling you about an experience I had, skydiving, and you've never skydove, you can kind of relate it to what you know, but you will kind of still not really know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it is on my bucket list.
I've actually not done it either. It was just a random example. And this theme comes up a lot, and he relates it to this kind of spiritual experience or psychedelic experience, in that when you are hearing about somebody's spiritual experience or experience, witnessing God or pure consciousness, and you've never had that experience for yourself, it can kind of sound like mumbo jumbo, like hogwash. And the only way to actually understand what that person has experienced is to have experienced something like it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
He says, quote, "It seems virtually certain that I shall never know what it feels like to be Sir John Falstaff or Joe Louis. On the other hand, it has always seemed to me possible that through hypnosis, for example, or auto-hypnosis by means of systematic meditation, or else by taking the appropriate drug, I might so change my ordinary mode of consciousness as to be able to know from the inside what the visionary, the medium, even the mystic were talking about." And he kind of does experience this. He at one point talks about this essay that he read by this Buddhist monk, Suzuki. And he says, this is during his trip, he says, "And I remembered then a passage I had read, one of Suzuki. He says, it had been, when I read it, only a vague, pregnant piece of nonsense. Now it was all as clear as day, as evident as Euclid."
Yeah, the fact that the interaction with, I feel like I should probably introduce the primary, secondary, tertiary from my model, just 'cause I'm going to be using that language the entire time.
Please do.
Yeah. So as part of the multi-sphere model of consciousness, which I've just put together slides for. So the way it breaks down is primary consciousness is the domain in which everything exists as a wave function. So the totality of existence as a quantum state. And so also referred to as the universal wave function. So as I showed you in the slides, there were at least 4 papers, but I'm sure many, many more. But the first guy who wrote about this was Hugh Everett, who wrote his master's thesis on it in the 50s and then wrote a shorter version and a longer version. But basically, this was the foundation of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So the one where at every choice point, you get a forked set of paths, this uncollapsed wave function. And so in this domain, everything exists all at once. And the analogy that I give is it's kind of like video game code where, everything that could ever happen in that game is there in the code. Everything that has happened, is happening now if you're playing it, will happen ever. All contained in that code. That's what the universal wave function, or what I'm calling primary consciousness in the model, is like. Secondary consciousness would be your own individualized experience of just pieces of primary consciousness. And the way this works, and just to give everybody background, I've been working at a lab at UCSB. And focused on a paper called General Resonance Theory. It's an electromagnetic field theory of consciousness. And essentially, it boils down to the basis of consciousness is shared resonance across different physical scales. And so we each, in our own secondary consciousness, through shared resonance, pull aspects of the primary from the all, from everything that exists, into our experience through synchrony in oscillations. And then tertiary consciousness is the interaction of one or more secondary consciousnesses. So we have enough shared oscillations that we can have a shared experience in space and time. I feel like those terms are going to come up in what I say. So.
No, that's great.
Okay.
And maybe we can try to map those to some of the language that Huxley uses, because this is one of the things we were talking about before we started recording, is that one of the problems in talking about these, like non-dualistic terms is that everybody kind of has a different word for more or less the same thing. There might be some little nuances, but each kind of thinker prefers their own term for God, or what Jung would call like the numinous. Huxley kind of calls this like mind at large.
And so the primary consciousness
or
would
primary
be
consciousness.
Implicate order, 0 point field, Purusa in Hinduism, Sunyata in Buddhism, holotropic state for Stanislav Grof in psychotherapy, right?
Maybe Brahman in Hinduism.
Right.
And it's kind of what we were talking about earlier. It's kind of a problem of language, because we're kind of by definition trying to use a word to describe something that by definition is ineffable.
Yes.
So you kind of run up against that problem.
Yeah, it's something beyond space and time. It's something beyond the senses. And so how do you put that into words? Often very difficult. Yeah.
Well, in Huxley's terminology isn't even really consistent throughout. At some point, he uses the term mind at large. At other times, he uses the Godhead, or the Dharma body of the Buddha, or isness. So they're all.
Well, he is a writer. So
he's a writer.
A little poetic license.
The writer in him was just like, I can't just use the same word 4 times in the same paragraph.
Suchness.
Yeah, would it get monotonous after a while?
Right.
But I think it is important to clarify that up front. Maybe we can just pick one term to refer to that concept. Do you want to use the...
This is what I was trying to do in my model. Yes. Yeah. That's why I threw it out there.
Yeah. So you primary consciousness.
Right.
Yeah. Let's use, when we're talking about
For
primary
suchness,
consciousness.
or Godhead or whatever.
Or mind at large.
Right.
We'll just hyphenate every time we...
primary. Yes.
Primary. And we might as well go into his theory about the kind of reducing valve theory of consciousness, because this is really, we're calling this this non-dual state of consciousness primary consciousness, and we're calling what a lot of us consider normal waking consciousness to be secondary. So that's already kind of, I think, flipping things, because I think most people probably think of like, when you're on a psychedelic,
this would be primary and that would be secondary.
Like when you're on a psychedelic, that is an altered state of consciousness, whereas as primary suggests that is actually more of the whole picture, and what we experience in quote normal waking consciousness is kind of a filtered version of that total consciousness.
Well said. Absolutely. Yeah. And if you think of it in terms of size scales, our secondary is just a teeny little drop in the ocean of the primary. Right. And your own individualized experience of it as well. So you have your own secondary. I have my own secondary. And that's a mind-blowing concept too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so this... what is called the reducing valve theory of consciousness was first put forward by the French philosopher Henry Bergson, and Huxley kind of lays it out in this essay. So I'm just going to read this, which he kind of breaks down this theory of consciousness. It says, quote, "The suggestion is that the function of the brain and nervous system and sense organs is in the main eliminative and not productive. Each person is at each moment capable of remembering all that has ever happened to him and of perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. The function of the brain and nervous system is to protect us from being overwhelmed and confused by this mass of largely useless, irrelevant knowledge by shutting out most of what we should otherwise perceive or remember at any moment, and leaving only that very small and special selection which is likely to be practical and useful." And then he says, according to such a theory, each one of us is potentially mind at large, but insofar as we are animals, our business is at all costs to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which will help us stay alive on the surface of this particular planet.
Well, this is absolutely consistent with the story that I was telling you about my experience with 5-MeO DMT last year. So, right, pivotal moment in my life. And that's what they say for most people who take this. It's 6 to 8 times stronger than the DMT and ayahuasca. Oh, wow. And so
is that said, the frog venom?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they said it lasted 8 minutes. To me, it felt like less than 60 seconds. And so initially took it, then looked at the guy's face who had given it to me, and all of a sudden it was pixelated, but the pixels had depth to them. So they were voxels, I guess, and they were all kind of wiggling. And then he had me go under a blanket so I could have a dark environment to experience this thing, which then felt to me like being on a train and going through a tunnel. And then all of a sudden it was, I assume, every little micro movement of my eye was a completely different scene, and it just got faster and faster.
Wow.
And then it felt like everything was absorbed into me. And they said that ego dissolution would happen during this experience. I'll tell you, there was no time to consider the nature of one's experience during this thing. I mean, it was so and it was overwhelming. And so, exactly to the point of the paragraph that you just read, it gave me an appreciation that I didn't have before, because I was looking for answers, and I had been into a lot of the Eastern religions and a lot of the, the New Age type material as well.
Sure.
And where it seemed to be about getting to the primary consciousness, no, you don't want to do that. It's completely it's too much.
Yeah.
It gave me a super appreciation for what we have here in secondary consciousness, where we can lay out things in space and time and create meaningful experiences for ourselves. So yeah, that was huge.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for sharing. That's so relevant. And that I like thinking about this in evolutionary terms, as he is kind of saying, and like the process of natural selection, we only evolve and adapt things that are going to benefit our survival and reproduction. And so if we are this, ape who is just completely experiencing the totality of consciousness, and, we're just enamored by a leaf in front of us, and we're just, contemplating existence, like, who's to say a lion's not going to come up behind us and just eat us?
Exactly.
So it would also be a liability. And that, as he mentions throughout his experience, like his will to do certain mundane tasks that he would deem important in this kind of normal waking consciousness or secondary consciousness, he just kind of, in this state of mind, is just like, what's the point? Like, why would I even think about, paying the bills or something when I'm just like one with the universe?
Yes. Stanislav Grof is one of my favorites, and he talks about the use of psychedelics in psychotherapy, and he makes a similar point too, that being in the holotropic state, as he defines it, so this would be primary consciousness, or a sense of that anyway. You're not actually in that domain, but yeah, probably not the best time when you're at the airport or whatever, like flying a plane,
trying to get shit done,
right? Yeah. Pound it out.
Right.
Yeah. No, you want to be in hylotropic state, which is his word for secondary. Yeah.
Which is interesting because there's like also the kind of microdosing craze that had kind of taken over Silicon Valley, which was mainly about kind of productivity and creativity. So a lot of people were using these compounds like LSD in very small doses to kind of be more productive. So that's kind of ironic that, if they were to bump up the dosage, they would just be like, what is the point of, this startup that I'm spending all of my waking hours doing?
Nice.
But not I don't think he's talking necessarily about like this experience makes him nihilistic as much as it just kind of reset his priorities.
Absolutely. You can see so much more. Yeah. Again, that size difference between the teeny little drop of secondary versus the massive possibilities there in primary. Right.
Yeah.
But funny you bring up microdosing. It's never been something, I don't know, that I wanted to do, because the body just adapts to any hedonic adaptation. So, it'll adjust to whatever you feed it, and then that'll become the new norm. So I like to personally just blast off sometimes and integrate those experiences for spirituality purposes. Yeah.
Right on. For sure. So going back to the reducing valve.
Yes.
The idea that the brain's main function is to cut out a lot of these stimuli. He thinks that that mescaline basically reduces the amount of glucose that can get to the brain. So basically the brain is just not able to function like it normally would to filter all of this out. I don't know if there's any science behind that, but
I know, because you don't really in these papers, for example, Robin Carhart Harris is probably the leading psychedelic researcher in the world, and not a lot of discussion of glucose in those papers. Mainly what unites psychedelics is the serotonin 2A receptor, which is associated with chronic stress.
Okay.
And so I can't remember if this is an explicit point that was made in these papers, or just something that I kind of intuited, but the idea that the reducing valve is opened through this chronic stress receptor, the thought that I have is, the body ordinarily filters out a lot of this information, which is not necessary to survival.
Yeah.
And it got that way probably over time, just pruning more and more of this info that we don't need, so that we can just focus on our day-to-day job. So ordinarily we're filtering out this information, but it may get to the point where we're so stressed that the body goes, okay, let's open that door because there might be something in there that helps us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
Have you heard of reticular activating system?
Yeah, right.
Which is, I think it's a similar idea of like, we are constantly bombarded by so much more stimuli than is useful and relevant to kind of the task at hand.
Absolutely.
That we are already filtering out so much of it. If you're a little kid looking for Waldo in a Where's Waldo, you are filtering out, your brain is filtering out everything that is not a red and white man, or not a red and white man, but a man with a red and white shirt.
Yeah.
And
Where's Waldo?
Yeah, the same way that, like, I don't know, if you're in a singles bar and you go out for a drink on a Saturday night, you will just naturally, unconsciously filter out 80% of the people in that bar who are not the gender that you're attracted to, the age that you're attracted to, you know, that this kind of filtering happens, you know, in our normal waking consciousness. So I like this theory that it's basically just kind of an extension of the reticular activating system.
Yeah, we have this salience network as well. So all these different resting state networks, there's 7 or 8 depending who you read. The salience one kind of points out what's important. So that's
interesting.
True too. Yeah.
Well, and he talks about how for most of us, our brain is more or less filtering out most of this primary consciousness. But there are certain individuals who their brain filters out less. So he talks a lot about artists as being kind of a branch of people who maybe are more tapped into this primary consciousness all the time.
Yeah, so there's 2 papers actually that come to mind that sort of relate to this. That nested observer windows paper that I was telling you about. My friend Justin Riddle and then Jonathan Schooler, who runs the lab that I've been volunteering for. But yeah, so they have, as part of their model, comes down to, well, they've defined it as alpha oscillations. Now, based on the information that I was looking at, even just this week, it may come down to that 1 over F frequency time and or fractal time or pink noise or whatever, determining the speed with which we are able to integrate information. But anyway, as part of their model, they talk about this refresh rate for alpha oscillations, and it's variable among different people. So there's this one experiment called the flicker fusion experiment where I think they were flashing a light for people, and there's a certain frequency where it just looks like it's always on. But it varies based on alpha speed for that individual. And so, so that would be potentially a scientific explanation for what he's talking about.
That's really interesting.
Absolutely.
There probably is some scientific basis for some of this stuff.
For sure. That's what I've been doing. Yeah.
Well, and he says, this is from the essay, quote, "What the rest of us see only under the influence of mescaline, the artist is congenially equipped to see all the time. His perception is not limited to what is biologically or socially useful." It made me think of this kind of anecdote. It might be apocryphal. I don't know if it actually happened, but Salvador Dali, the expressionist painter.
Love him.
Or expressionist? The
Surrealist.
Surrealist painter, thank you. Who was once asked if he took drugs because his paintings are so psychedelic, and he responded...
Quite suggested,
and he responded by saying, "I am drugs."
Yes.
So I love that, and I think that kind of maps onto this idea is that Dali was probably one of these people who was just maybe his brain was filtering out less of the primary consciousness.
True. And as part of these papers as well, they talk about how people who both have quote unquote mental health disorders, some of them, and then what we see through their use of psychedelics, there's more functional complexity, more functional connectivity that is entropic or disordered
Okay.
So, but again, it comes down to filtering in information from the primary that most people are not integrating. So,
well, yeah, and he talks about like schizophrenics as well as being maybe a class of people who filter out less of this primary consciousness.
Right. It's just about learning how to functionally integrate that, which we were talking about as part of my
yeah,
my
and that's kind of the problem he sees with. He says, maybe this will kind of highlight it. He says, quote, "The schizophrenic is like a man permanently under the influence of mescaline and therefore unable to shut off the experience of a reality which he is not holy enough to live with, which he cannot explain away because it is the most stubborn of primary facts, in which, because it never permits him to look at the world with merely human eyes, scares him into interpreting its unremitting strangeness, its burning intensity of significance as the manifestations of human or even cosmic malevolence."
Well, I'm reminded of that Terence McKenna quote that I read you as well, where the shaman swims in the same ocean as the schizophrenic. The only difference is the shaman has thousands upon thousands of years of sanctioned technique in figuring out how to integrate this information in a functional way, And so in traditional societies, people with quote unquote schizophrenic tendencies were told, you are special, you have unique abilities, and you figure out how to do this. You will guide our society in its most valuable decisions. Dude, if you can pull information about what has happened, is happening, will happen, that's very useful. But you got to figure out how to do that functionally, and that's where we're stuck. And I think there's this neurodivergence movement now where instead of necessarily kind of looking at certain conditions and saying, oh, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem, and trying to suppress everybody back into this range of neurotypical, as it's called. Instead, sort of looking at, okay, you've got some challenges, but it also comes with some strengths as well, because you're probably pulling in signals that most people are not.
Sure.
For example, with autism, you getting extra signals that don't really make sense in terms of the five senses, but you also often are really good at, deep work and amazing little specialties and things. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The ability to focus on something very complex.
Like you mentioned earlier, that, a lot of kind of like hunter-gatherer communities would have reverence for the people with schizophrenia and kind of see them as having like this divine connection or ability. Like there's a book, Black Elk Speaks, which is kind of about this as well. But I think what Huxley is getting at here is like a lot of them haven't been able to integrate it. And like we mentioned earlier, this pure consciousness or primary consciousness can be extremely overwhelming, especially to somebody who is, younger or less kind of cognitively, spiritually, emotionally matured. And what he was saying is like a lot of schizophrenics will kind of take this onslaught of stimuli coming at them and kind of represent it as being like kind of evil or malevolent.
I do know someone with schizophrenia, and kind of paranoid mentality has sort of an underlying tone to a lot of his experiences. Yeah, which is an unfortunate piece.
There's also the connection between, I know that some psychedelics can trigger schizophrenia in somebody who is kind of genetically prone to it.
Predisposed
to it. Yeah. So yeah, there seems to be some kind of correlation there, but
yeah, that has been shown. Yeah.
Let's see. We talked about the artist, the schizophrenic. He also says like the genius is somebody who, and this has kind of made me think of like when people say there's a fine line between like genius and madness.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Often in the same individual. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, he definitely walked that line.
Yeah. Well, even someone like Nikola Tesla, who I love, but with the 369 and things had to be in those numbers, and he had a bunch of pigeons where he was living in his hotel. They were his friends.
Oh man, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
He's a very quirky guy.
Totally. Yeah.
Totally. Well, I was gonna say, we talked about earlier how this pure consciousness or primary consciousness can just be extremely overwhelming, especially to somebody who is not kind of prepared to witness it.
Right.
And he talks a little bit here about what can happen to the unprepared when they're experiencing this. So he says, quote, "The literature of religious experience, it abounds in references to the pains and terrors of overwhelming those who have come too suddenly face to face with some manifestation of the mysterium tremendum," which I think is just another kind of term for this primary consciousness. Mm-hmm. In theological language, this fear is due to the incompatibility between man's egotism and the divine purity, between man's self-aggravated separateness and the infinity of God.
Yeah, the difference between secondary and primary. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that when we were in this secondary or kind of normal waking consciousness, we have this very vivid feeling of being a self separate from other. We kind of see the world more or less dualistically. I am me, you are you. This microphone is this microphone.
Yes.
Whereas under this primary consciousness, that those lines start to blur. And that is threatening to the ego. That is threatening to this conception of the self. And that can lead to just like crippling fear for a lot lot of people.
Yeah,
And
which is why that happens with the magic mushrooms for some the paranoia.
yeah, I have had, when I did psilocybin mushrooms,
Yeah.
I remember feeling like I was dying.
Wow. Okay.
And it was a very scary experience. And I remember telling a friend of mine who was older and, had much more experience with taking psychedelics and whatnot. And he's like, you know what that was when you felt like you were dying? He's like, that was your ego. That was your ego death. And I did experience a kind of ego death. And that's kind of what he's pointing to here, is that like a lot of the religious literature points to this same kind of fear and terror that people can experience when kind of witnessing this primary consciousness, or as it is often termed in religious language, God. And I think that's important to draw. And I know there's like there's a lot of baggage with just that word God, but I think it's important to point out that a lot of times when people are talking about seeing God or the Godhead, they, in some instances, are referring to the same thing that people who are talking about primary consciousness are referring to.
Yeah, I think Roberto Assagioli's model of psychosynthesis is really helpful here. So when you tap into the collective unconscious, or I guess in his model it would all just be the unconscious, he divides it into 3 layers. So the lower unconscious, which is kind of the id type stuff, middle unconscious, which is more just subconscious processes that we use, and then higher consciousness is spiritual aspirations and stuff. But you can't just selectively tap into the higher one, right? You get the whole bag. It comes all together. It's the universal wave function, so it contains everything. And so that's why I think in some of these experiences, it can go either way for people, because
totally.
Yeah.
Well, and I was actually thinking of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, love it.
There's a chapter in the Gita called the Cosmic Vision, where Arjuna witnesses Krishna in its kind of most exalted form.
Yes.
So this was, chapter 11 of the Gita. Quote, Krishna, the master of yoga, revealed to Arjuna his most exalted lordly form. He appeared with an infinite number of faces, ornamented by heavenly jeweled, displaying unending miracles in the countless weapons of his power. Clothed in celestial garments and covered with garlands, sweet-smelling with heavenly fragrances. He showed himself as the infinite Lord, the source of all wonders, whose face is everywhere. If 1,000 suns were to rise in the heavens at the same time, the blaze of their light would resemble the splendor of the Supreme Spirit. And then kind of Arjuna's reaction to this says, quote, "The multitudes of gods, demigods, and demons are all overwhelmed by the sight of you. O mighty Lord, at the sight of your myriad eyes and mouths, arms and legs, stomachs, and fearful teeth, I and the entire universe shake in terror."
I love that you read that. That is what that piece means for me. Yeah, exactly what I was just talking about with the whole bag comes with it. The
That's
good,
kind of
bad,
like
the ugly.
witnessing this, that primary consciousness directly.
Right,
or
and all those different levels.
Yeah, or in religious terms, seeing God directly.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a part of a kind of this like spiritual awakenings that people have that is not often talked about, is that there can be a terrifying aspect of them.
Yeah, for that 5-MeO experience, which was pivotal, and I'm so glad that I had that. That was a turning point.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, just so overwhelmingly too much that it was terrifying. Yes.
Yeah, and like Krishna scares the shit out of Arjuna.
Yes.
And I think it's also important to point out that Krishna is the kind of symbolic representation of this thing that we're talking about.
Right.
God.
Yes.
Pure consciousness.
Yes. Nature as well, and Spinoza's version of it. Yeah. Which when Einstein was asked whether he believed in God, he said, I believe in Spinoza's God. So it's synonymous with nature. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. He also talks a little bit about the kind of morality of the contemplative person. Mm-hmm. And I think he's kind of mentioning this in terms of like, all right, some people might look at somebody like a monk who has kind of shut themselves off from the working life and is just in a monastery meditating, and kind of say like, come on, man, like, who are you helping? You know, that's kind of a thing that gets brought, and he's kind of responding to that a little bit here. He says, quote, "Half at least of all morality is negative and consists in keeping out of mischief." And then he says, "The one-sided contemplative leaves undone many things that he ought to do, but to make up for it, he refrains from doing a host of things he ought not to do." So, you know, he's saying like, all right, well, at least that Buddhist monk is, you know, he's not like robbing banks and like lighting shit on fire. In that, like, a lot of what makes somebody a good, and you know, you look at like the 10 Commandments, most of them are like, thou shalt not do this.
The Old Testament to me is just, it's so brutish.
Yeah, but it's mostly
it's a different time,
but the morality is a lot. I think what his point is, it's very much framed in terms of the negative, in that the moral person, at least in some framings, is the person who is not getting into mischief, is not, you know, sinning.
For me too, one thing that comes to mind is just, I mean, reading the Bhagavad Gita and, you know, the fact that this is a multi-life game as well. I mean, there are very important lives where we're spending most of our time in solitary kind of spiritual development. These are really important lives to get all the way through at some point to individuation.
Sure. Well, and he says that like the person who has spent a great deal of time in contemplation or has kind of had one of these mystical experiences is able to take that experience and communicate it to others, or to kind of, you know, pass the torch, so to speak. So that if, you know, we'd use the monk in the monastery example, that if they attain enlightenment, that they will then kind of then be able to return the boon. And that's kind of like what the Buddha did, right? The Buddha didn't just
even the little mini steps along the way as well. I mean, we're all part of that. This is part of tertiary consciousness in the model. So we are all part of these collective consciousnesses as well. So the fact that that guy's pulling his weight in terms of raising his vibration, expanding his consciousness, is helping everybody else, you know?
Totally.
So, right.
Totally.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I meditate is like, yes, I do it for selfish reasons. It makes me happier. It makes me calmer, clears my anxiety. But I also feel like it benefits other people in my life that I meditate, because I'm able to be patient with them. I'm able to be kinder to them. I'm less reactive.
And this is perfect. I feel like this is the point of life, trying to find where you can do what you love and benefit others at the same time. That's a sweet spot. So
yeah.
Bravo.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of ties into his conception of enlightenment. So I found this really interesting. Huxley says, quote, "I am not so foolish as to equate what happens under the influence of mescaline or of any drug, prepared or in the future prepared, with the realization of the end and ultimate purpose of human life, enlightenment, the beatific vision." So he is saying like, okay, well, what I experience on mescaline, like this experience, the spiritual experience that he had, was not enlightenment. And I think he's saying it's not enlightenment because it was not sustained or integrated.
Ooh, well, Maslow has two different terms for this. So peak versus plateau experiences.
Oh, interesting.
Peak would be the temporary ones where, yay, I think I found it. And then,
kind of like a experience on mescaline.
Exactly. Or in meditation, or a number of different contexts.
Running a marathon, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas
sure.
plateau is, now you're the Buddha. And you can sustain it. Right.
Well, and to capture that, he says, quote, "To be enlightened is to be aware always of total reality in its immanent otherness, to be aware of it and yet to remain in a condition to survive as an animal, to think and feel as a human being, to resort whenever expedient to systematic reasoning." So this made me think of like, yeah, the enlightened person is able to kind of be experiencing this total awareness and this primary consciousness, while at the same time, holding a day job and
secondary. Yeah.
and, communicating with others, and more or less has integrated it to the point where they are not just that person who is just completely overwhelmed, or that person who is just transfixed by like a leaf or something. They're actually able to integrate it.
Right. Yeah. And help others with that information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought that was definitely worth pointing out, and his kind of conception of enlightenment I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
The other thing he talks about is this kind of need for self-transcendence that all people have, in his view. And he says, quote, "The urge to escape from selfhood and the environment is in almost everyone almost all the time." He says, "The urge to transcend self-conscious selfhood is a principal appetite of the soul." And I don't think this is an original idea to him. I think a lot of other people have probably thought about this, but he thinks that this is a lot of the reason why we abuse things like drugs and alcohol, and even like tobacco, is like, he says like, either because our lives are so painful that we just kind of want to escape, or they're so boring and monotonous that we want to escape through this. Mm-hmm. And yeah, he talks quite a bit about kind of like alcohol abuse, tobacco abuse.
Yeah, I haven't had a drink since 2014, and
oh, really? Yeah.
I didn't even go into it thinking that I would quit. I originally was just gonna take 3 weeks off and reset my tolerance, but I got to the end of that period, and I was like, you know what?
You don't miss it.
Yeah. And I could think so much clearer, and I could suddenly run all the way around Central Park without running any more often. And also just the energy level. Yeah, they say that, these substances, they poke holes in your aura, and it was as though I could feel that. And so one of my nervous habits when I had a lot of energy was to do this, and I started doing that during that period. And I was
kind of fidget your hands.
Yeah. But I'm just retaining more energy. And so
that's cool. My mom's kind of actually undergoing, like, she's kind of taking a break from alcohol as well.
Yeah.
Noticing some positive effects.
I love it, yeah.
Yeah, well, and he says, he's kind of talking about what has happened in the culture, and this was in the 1950s. He says most of these modifiers of consciousness cannot now be taken except under doctor's orders, or else illegally and at considerable risk. So he's talking about kind of the outlaw of most of these psychedelics at the time. And then he says, for unrestricted use, the West has permitted only alcohol and tobacco. All of the other chemical doors in the wall are labeled dope, and their unauthorized takers are fiends. So yeah, that's something that often gets talked about is like, you know, why is it that alcohol and tobacco are legal in this country, but
I know the hypocrisy of the whole thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
He doesn't really give any theories. I mean, some of the theories I've heard is like, basically it's whatever substances will lead to more work being done.
Exactly.
So sugar and caffeine.
Oh yeah. Right. Yeah, I've heard that explanation and that fits. Yeah.
And that also, I mean, going back kind of the history of peyote and mescaline, I found it interesting to learn that when the Spanish conquistadors came over, they tried to suppress peyote, and they tried to like basically strip it from the indigenous people of Mexico because, and this was kind of Pollan's own hypothesis. He was thinking it was because it threatened Christianity, and that these people were kind of experiencing God directly through this drug. And if you have people experiencing something directly for themselves, they won't really need a priest to go through, and the church kind of becomes irrelevant at that point.
Right. Direct experience. Yeah, I see that as the difference between maybe spirituality and religion.
Yeah.
It's a whole different kind of mindset sometimes.
Yeah. So it's been an interesting kind of this kind of war on drugs didn't just start with Nixon in the 60s. Like it's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah.
And
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you know MDMA, it's been around since 1919 or 1920. Like, it's super old. And then it was used in the 40s for psychotherapy for a while. And then 80s, people were using it recreationally. And they were like, okay, all right, we got to shut down the party. But it's actually going to be rescheduled. Or they're thinking about doing that, taking it off the schedule and making it
I actually have a friend who is training to be MDMA therapist.
Oh, the same one that you were talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so she's in training for that right now.
Nice.
And it looks like it's going to become legal.
Yeah.
I mean, everything's pointing that direction.
Right. Yeah.
And they've already opened up clinics, and a lot of the research around like its effects for people suffering PTSD is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, so I took these neuroscience courses from Harvard through edX, and
cool.
A couple of them referenced, or at least one segment talked about MDMA, psychotherapy, and we're talking about the amazing benefits that they had seen. So yeah, tough to argue with.
Yeah, right. It's tough to argue with the science.
Yeah.
Cool. That was kind of the end of my notes. Was there more spots that you want to hit on a little bit more, or
okay. So one thing that I did want to add from the model, which I thought was really exciting, is just thinking about individuation in the context of this model of consciousness that we've been sort of laying out with the primary, secondary, tertiary. Just thinking about the way that Jung defined, so the ego would be secondary consciousness, the conscious mind, and then he had the personal ego, which potentially is, if we think about the universal wave function where all the possibilities exist, could that be other versions of yourself that you have not experienced directly in this lifetime, integrating the lessons from those other timelines, which is really interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
And then for collective unconscious, that would be all these different pools of tertiary consciousness. So where you're in, the collective forms, different size groups, your relationship with your family, individuals, but also groups, and where you work, and your city, the fact that you're part of humanity, integrating lessons from all of these other lives as well, and just doing that and being able to tap into primary consciousness and opening you up to experience more and more in the form of memories from these other beings. So
yeah, that's very interesting because it's like it doesn't only broaden your kind of horizons, but there also might be some, yeah, like you said, insights from like a past life or something that you're also integrating.
Past lives,
Yeah.
because they're all present. Yeah.
Right.
In that realm.
In that realm, right.
Yeah.
There's no differentiation.
Right.
Well, and he kind of ends this essay by, talking about enlightenment, which we kind of spoke about, but he does say, basically, like, even if we don't attain enlightenment from taking a substance like this, even kind of glimpsing this mind at large or primary consciousness, that can still be something that has a ripple effect on the rest of our lives. Mm-hmm. It says, quote, "The man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out. He will be wiser but less cocksure, happier but less self-satisfied, humbler in acknowledging his ignorance, yet better equipped to understand the relationship of words to things, of systematic reasoning to the unfathomable mystery, which it tries forever in vanity to comprehend."
Yeah, so kind of tapping into, again, a much larger pool and realizing how little you know as this drop in the ocean.
Yeah. That's the kind of humbling experience I think he's talking about.
Yes. Cool.
Well, this was awesome. This was so much fun.
Yes, thanks again,
Yeah.
Zach. This was great for me too.
Yeah.
Everything about it. The fact, reading that piece and the way it happened to correlate with what I was doing so perfectly because I finished it this morning.
Exactly. And I selfishly got the sneak peek of the entire model. And
right.
this was cool that we got to share some of it on the podcast too.
Yeah, you heard it first.
Sweet. Well, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you again, Zach.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend or scroll down and write us a review or give us a rating. All that stuff helps, so thanks for doing that in advance. If you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And finally, if you would like to hear more from my guest Nikki and to see what she's up to, check out her LinkedIn page. I included it in the show notes, and there you can find all the interesting stuff that she's been getting up to studying consciousness out in California. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.